All right, so final week. Appreciate y'all in this experiment. I mean, this was definitely a very different type of class, and we're getting a lot of feedback. We're trying to sort of work in this situation. I've heard a lot from our students at Zhengda, and they've been pretty excited. I don't know how many of you have had individual emails, but I've had some emails on the back channel with a couple of students. And of course, Dr. Lynn and I have been colleagues for a very long time. So her and I know each other we both went to Michigan State together for our PhDs. But anyway, the short answer is people seem to have really enjoyed this. And I think we're going to keep trying it. So, I appreciate y'all being willing to sort of try this experimental setup. The funny thing is a lot of folks think it's because of COVID, but ironically enough, I think the setup would have been the exact same way, whether it was COVID or not, just because of the way it's just how the clock works. In fact, Dr. Lynn and I do a lot of research together, and one of the hardest parts of collaborating is that, again, she's 14 hours ahead of me. So whenever we try to set up our schedules, it's always kind of wild. So, I mean, hell, Phil and I sometimes have to coordinate when he's down the road. I can't even imagine what it's like that, I'm 14 hours away, right? Thankfully, and hopefully some of you all get an opportunity to visit Taiwan. If there's one thing that is not hard to find there, it is an internet connection. You would be shocked at the price. Just on the call, I'm curious, how much do you all pay a month for your wireless? Or how much does your family pay a month for wireless access?
$80 for a gigabit internet.
$80. How about other people? Does that sound pretty similar? Like $80-ish?
We pay our phone bill at my house.
Yeah, around there.
Because I live on a farm and we don't have cable.
I use AT&T for inbound orders.
Yeah, 80 is not too far off. I'll be curious what our students over there respond with in terms of their rate. I rented a wireless router for the 6 months I was living there. Of course, I came back early. It came out, it was a 4G router. Now they have 5G routers that can handle 8 connections at once, gigabyte wireless, mobile, so I could take it with me. And I believe the total cost for 6 months was $120. And that was considered high because I was renting it. I didn't own it. So it's pretty wild. 1 second, I'm going to, thank you, Avery, I appreciate that. All right, cool. But anyway, it's always an interesting one, which, by the way, something we talked about, and I think it came up in some of our chat. How many of you noticed that our colleagues at Zhengda did a lot of mobile gaming? There was a lot of discussion of, like, cell phone games, smartphone games. And I wonder if some of that has to do with just, they are more accessible in terms of, like, the data plans, the access plans. And if you ever get a chance to visit, there is a wonderful technology sector. And it's funny because there's both like a brand new shiny mall that has all the latest VR, 360 cameras, any new tech you can think of. But right around it is like an old, basically, I wouldn't say black market, but like where you would go to build computers. But they're not brand new stuff. It's all like there's shops that are just nothing but wires.
E-market?
What's that?
E-market?
Yeah, kinda. And it's just funny seeing like this very rough around the edges market surrounding this like massive gleaming mall. And I'm just forgetting the name of the markets right now, but they were my favorite place to hang out when I was in Taipei. And you'd be surprised what you can purchase over there. So if you have any friends you make in class, they can probably get video cards for you way cheaper. You can get them here. So, get some connections. And the postage is not bad. Shenghua Post is remarkably efficient. So I mailed my ballots in from Taipei, and they actually got to Lubbock faster than when I was living in Lubbock. I think it took 5 days to get a ballot from Taipei to Lubbock, but living here and mailing the ballot, it took 3 weeks. So that was interesting. So today's class, we're going to speak a little bit about avatars. And they're the objects that, in some ways, they quite literally mediate our experiences, right? Because in almost every digital immersive experience, your connection with the environment is done through your avatar, right? Of course, there are some where you are essentially the avatar. And in fact, as I hope some of our VR colleagues notice, there's not as much on this in VR either. In parks, I think there's always been a presumption that you would be the character, right? You would be the person in the environment. So those are your hands and that's your body. But we can talk about some of those implications as we go through. I didn't get to update some of the slides. I was hoping to put some stuff from later VR systems, but I'll just hope that you can talk about it later. And so today's format's a little different. What I did, I'm going to give you something that's probably a little more data heavy than you're used to. I took actually the presentations of this research from prior conferences and sort of stitched them together into like a blast from the past to talk about where this research came from. And then we'll end up with where it could go. So this is kind of a neat one because this is an area of work that is more or less originated from faculty at Tech. So demand will be one. That was the model that I've been working on with Tammy and with some other colleagues. But the PAR and PACS research is also one that's originated mostly from faculty here. And it's taken off pretty well. I was going on Google Scholar. I don't know how many of you use that platform. You might use it in research a lot. But I was pulling up PAR and PACS. The Avatar papers, and one of the things I wanted to show you was how often they get cited. And so like we have, let me see here, so you may have seen websites like this before. So this would actually be a Google Scholar search, but you can search by an individual researcher. And so this would be my profile, the papers I've published, then how often they've been cited. And what I wanted to pull up on here was the PACS stuff. And so some of these papers, like this was one where we did a language analysis of how people talk about their avatars, has been cited 85 times. And what that means is other researchers in the field are using this research to build their own research. And so I think this has actually been one of our more successful. The paper you read that gave the PACS scale has been cited 60 times. And so it suggests, now, of course, who knows? Maybe they're all saying, this is terrible research, don't read it, right? But it's kind of cool because you can click on here, and then you can see all the different papers that are citing that work. And some of them are me citing it myself, right? But you can go through here and see like how people are using this stuff in different environments, in different areas. So as you start reading scholarship, one of the things I would encourage you to do is do this sort of backward citation change where look at the citations and see what they're talking about as well, because you might be surprised. Like here's somebody who's looking at anxiety and video gaming, and they're using pair-avatar relationships. And if you go further, you can look at people doing in different languages, of course. You can go through some of these things. You can get an idea for like who's doing what with the research, especially for some of the questions you have in class, right? Not that we can't talk about them, of course, but you might find out that other folks are doing things with them. Here's a person doing research on travel and place attachment and looking at this in terms of, avatar interactions and things like that. So this can always be kind of a cool way to get an idea of, somebody looking at research on Detroit Becoming Human, and they were doing it through the lens of character attachment and things like this. Here's even one on COVID-19. So it's always kind of a cool way to see where research is going. Of course, one of the things that scholars hate is when their research gets used incorrectly and it causes fights. It's always kind of funny. But anyway, I thought what I would do is go through some of the history of this work and where it came from, and hoping that would trigger us to think a bit more about where it could go. One of the things that I'm hoping you're picking up in this course is that it's not necessarily trying to teach you like, this is fact. Like, this is established, this is the rules, this is what we're going to do. But in many ways, what I'm trying to do instead is establish a baseline of things you could ask questions about. I've noticed a couple of students in class have been asking research questions, and frankly, those could turn into theses or capstone projects or independent studies. Every year, there's an undergraduate research symposium at Tech, and I sponsor projects in that contest. And many of your ideas could be turned into projects there. So, these are things that we could always talk about. Obviously, normally, many of you would have already been in the lab for various reasons. If this was a non-COVID semester, we'd be touching and playing with all that stuff. Instead, obviously, you've been kind of, distance away. But that's going to change soon. And for those of you who are going to be around for another year or so, we should continue talking about this, because I've seen some pretty cool ideas coming up in those projects. And as Lindsay and Phil can tell you, I tend to be pretty cranky about ideas. So if I'm seeing something I like, it's usually because I really do like it. I'm not just kind of blowing smoke and things like that. That being said, I think I'll dive in. Okay, and like all of our classes, you can jump in anytime and ask questions. Sometimes I'll try to redirect them to make sure we can fit them in the flow of the conversation, but feel free to hop in. And again, you're going to see a lot of things on here with old affiliations. For example, this research was done back when we were still at West Virginia. Okay, so when we're talking about avatars, it's sort of a concept that, as you've learned in this class, lots of words get used, and they get used in very inconsistent ways. And I think avatar is one of those words. It gets thrown around a lot. In fact, even in my own research, sometimes I will confuse avatars and characters. Some people argue the difference matters. Some people argue the difference doesn't matter. And so one distinction people have made is that an avatar is something that you have created, and a character is something that has already been created. So if you're playing a video game as Batman, Batman is not your avatar. You're playing as Batman. But then that gets confusing, because in some ways it may not matter very much insofar as Batman is your avatar in that digital space, right? Just because the character already exists doesn't mean it's not an avatar. I'm not sure that question's been answered, frankly. Sometimes I wonder if it has to do more with, and who knows, maybe they're separate things. Maybe an avatar can or can't be a character. It's not quite clear, and I'm not sure how much I want to get lost in it, because I don't want to get too spun around, although we can certainly talk about it. What I'll offer up is that when we say avatar, number one, we're talking about graphical user representations. And what that means is you're seeing something on screen, right? And that thing is a representation of you in that world, right? Do you know where that word comes from, avatar?
It's probably based in Latin of some accord.
It actually comes out of Eastern philosophies. And it comes out of Hindu. Referring to, I don't know how familiar you are with, like, Vishnu, for example, but the avatars of Vishnu. He would come back to Earth in different forms, and those different forms represented his agency on Earth, right? In fact, one of the ideas behind, and I hope I'm getting this correct, is that the 10th avatar will represent essentially the end of the world and a rebirth. And of course, the 10th avatar of Vishnu is not returned yet. He's had 9 previous incarnations of Vishnu. And if you read the stories, Vishnu is sort of an ephemeral idea or a god, right? Who can take the form of various things for various reasons. And in fact, I was trying to, I'm going to pull up the image cycle here. So the different avatars of Vishnu came to Earth in different forms, because the different forms, that's a video. I didn't want that. I'm sorry. The different avatars played different roles. Okay. And you'll have to forgive me, I don't remember the exact stories, but the point for our conversation is that different avatars had different tasks and different roles on Earth. And in a way, isn't that kind of how digital avatars work? Like, we have different avatars for different tasks, for different relationships. They work in different ways. But of course, there's something in common with them, is that we're all of them. So just like all of these are representations of Vishnu, all of our avatars are representations of us. And that's sort of the general idea behind that concept. By the way, if you are into philosophies and mythologies and religion, give these a read. They're fascinating stories. Alex, yeah.
So when you talk about avatars, could that also mean accounts, such as my Steam account would count as my avatar, or would that more be only the representation?
So this has been an interesting debate in research. And I think it has to do with this word graphical, right? I think that
I have a
word,
profile picture on Steam.
that's where I'm going, right? It's a bit open. I think that most people, when they're studying this, are studying like bodies. But we've actually written research on how player avatar relations could apply to social media. That you can look at somebody's Facebook page or their Reddit account or their Discord channel as an avatar. Because like Alex said, there could be an image, right? But there could even be a screen name. Can a screen name be an avatar? And I think a lot of scholars would say, yeah, you know. So it's been, like I said, I don't think the theoretical precision is really good here. What happens sometimes is we define things in a realm and it works just fine for that realm. But then when they get borrowed for other realms, it causes problems, right? So, Alex, it's a fair question. And I think it's a fair critique, actually. And again, we've written about this. We have a whole book chapter trying to argue for the use of Pax and Par on explaining like LinkedIn pages. Like, could you look at a LinkedIn page as somebody's avatar? And then, like, is it an avatar is me or an avatar is other? Or, like, you could look at these things. And it might have real implications for how people approach social media. Think about when you're in a Discord channel and you've got one person just spamming and flaming the whole channel. You know, that person may have a different orientation towards their account that other people don't share. So if there's 10 people in the room and 9 of them are there to talk and one person's there to play games, right? They could have very different relationships. So it's, I think it's a good question. I don't think it's been answered not because nobody wants to, but because there's been so much of a focus on video games. Yeah, so it's an open book, but it's a good call. The important thing is that it's more than just a representation. It's a representation that carries agency. And when we say agency, what we're referring to is your ability to influence the environment. So not only does the avatar represent you, but it represents your ability to do things. You know, you can only do things in that environment through your avatar. Again, going back to Vishnu, that was how the god came to Earth and then was able to exert agency over people, was through these avatars. And this works the exact same way, right? Without your avatar, you can't do anything, right? The avatar also carries meaning, right? Different avatars, and I think Alex brought this question up about, like, do we remember faces? Do we remember personalities? Do we remember characteristics of avatars? Because, you know, people remember faces better than names, and the research just kind of says, yeah. It's a little confounded because in most environments you get both at the same time. But generally speaking, we do know from prior work that folks can see an avatar and ascribe like meaning to it. That person's aggressive, that person's passive, that person's nice. Just like you might use the same heuristics in regular interactions face to face. And because of this representation and it has agency, we've kind of already said, it is the literal mediator of gameplay. You experience a game through your avatar, right? And that becomes kind of interesting when you're studying these things. Because we know they're important, but it's often hard to specify why exactly they're important. And so my hope is conversations today will help break that up a little bit. Okay. So normally, when most of us think about a game avatar, you know, we think that it basically does whatever we tell it to do. Right? Like, turn the game on, and there's a thing on screen, and it's just waiting for your commands. Right? You do it, you tell it to do stuff, and then it does stuff. It doesn't fight back. It doesn't argue with you. It's just supposed to do whatever you want to do. You know, it's in some ways you can see my computer mouse moving around here, and my most video games, I don't expect Mario is not that much different than this little cursor, right? I want him to go somewhere, he's going to go somewhere. I want to click on something, he's going to click on something, right? There might be some boundary conditions set in place by the video game itself. So over the holiday break, I did the unthinkable, and Phil will make fun of me for this. I turned my computer off for 3 days and just did not touch it, didn't care. Like, the world is dead to me. And I think you all have heard me talk about Red Dead Revolver and how I never actually advance the story. I just ride around on my horse and go fishing. I finally got from 5% complete to 45% complete over a 3-day binge. It was a pretty amazing move. Which, by the way, now all I do is go back and hunt. But that's a different story. The legendary animals and the treasure maps. Oh no, Phil. I have the original Red Dead Revolver. Like the first John Marston, PS2, like the old... In fact, I just now made the connection in Red Dead Redemption 2 that it takes place before Red Dead Revolver. Because I'm like, they keep yelling at John Marston. Oh, that's how he got his scars. Okay, now I understand why he looks so weird in that game. That's the joy of being an old gamer. It's kind of like when I was... Anybody watching Mandalorian?
Yep.
Yeah? No? Did you watch it last night? Yeah.
Last night's episode was great.
Last night's episode brought it all home for me. No spoilers, but that's it. Like, it brought it. It was a shout out to Star Wars fans, like, without question. And in fact, the moment, yeah. Yeah, it's awesome.
The moment that thing happened.
Yeah, you get it, and you're like, yep, okay, I got this. I am tuned in. You'll tune in, folks, I promise. Don't let anybody bother you during it. So, like in that game, right, I can do a lot in sandbox games, but I can't do everything, right? One of the things I noticed, like when I'm playing Red Dead Redemption 2, is sometimes I know what I want to do, but I can't get the controller to do it because there's too many buttons. So I get attacked by cougars, and I know I need to shoot them, but I keep pushing the wrong button because I'm panicking or whatever. Or like, sometimes the environment might be a little weird where you can't walk up a certain incline, but you can walk up every other incline. So I get the idea that like programming limitations can restrict you. But for the most part, that cowboy's doing what I want him to do. I have also noticed I am a bad person. If anybody insults me in that game, I just shoot them. So I walk up to everybody and I hold down, our L2, greet or antagonize. I always greet everybody. Howdy, partner. Hey, mister. And if they don't say something nice back to me, I just shoot them. And I steal their 63 cents. Right? So I pay my bounties off or whatever. Anyway, you get the idea. We expect avatars to do what we say. Okay? Mm-hmm. And in fact, a lot of the early research on this, from that perspective, really just focused on this thing called character attachment. And it was just, okay, your avatar is you. That's the assumption. And now we can just look at how much are you attached to you. Though we can say maybe that avatars in video games are like a psychological merging between the player and the avatar. That they're two different things, because I can see the avatar and I'm sitting here. But maybe what we can do is look at them in terms of, are they really one thing at the end of the day? Sorry, I got to open up a file really quick. I apologize. I'm going to take a couple of final semester screenshots, and I want to have a place to put them. So when we do this, we can look at, okay, how much do I identify with the avatar? So maybe an important part of this process is the extent to which I see myself as the avatar. I see myself having similar qualities and things of that nature, right? Or maybe it's suspension of disbelief. What does that mean, suspension of disbelief? It's a very popular concept in film.
It means that you essentially suspend your logical part of your brain in a situation. So when you're presented with something that wouldn't realistically happen, you're like, okay, I'm not going to let that pull me out of the situation. I'm just going to...
Yeah, that's definitely fair. That's definitely fair. And in fact, Newer research has suggested that it's not the suspension of disbelief, but what it might be is willingly believing things. And the idea is that it takes too much cognitive energy to suspend disbelief. And what happens instead is that unless an environment gives us a reason not to believe it, we assume it's okay. And you see this a lot, like I said, especially in film theory. Like, the idea is that the audience will accept what you give them until you do something stupid or weird. And then they're going to go, nope, I'm out. I don't care anymore. Right?
Yeah. Can I interject?
Yeah, please.
So basically it's like, to me, it's like, we're given a world. Here is its rules. Here's how it works.
Right.
As long as it is consistent within that, I think the audience is mostly fair.
Exactly
mostly
right.
Like when you get there.
Yeah.
Like a lightsaber is not real, but we willingly accept, this is a weapon that exists in this universe. Okay.
Exactly right. And that's been the newer research. So if you look at the research on narrative engagement and transportation theory, they talk a lot about this idea that as long as it's consistent, and realism doesn't mean has to be real. It just means has to be real within that world. So like in the James Bond universe, we're going to accept certain gadgets that don't actually work that way, but it's fine because it's in that universe, And there's some kind of cool concepts there. And in fact, I don't know when I'll teach it, but there'll be a class called 3375, CMI 3375, and it'll be an analysis of entertainment media, where I'm going to talk about some of the theories that predict the ways entertainment works. And in that class, I'll talk about many of these concepts, like the one we're talking about right now. So there's also sense of control, and that one's pretty basic. It's to what extent do I feel like I can actually make things happen on screen? And this often has to be like with, I push a button, that character does something, right? And then there was this idea of the sense of responsibility. And this is kind of a neat one. The argument here is the extent to which I feel literally responsible for the character's actions. So going back to Red Dead Redemption 2, I remember I tried playing the game as a white hat, as a good person. And what I found in that game, and maybe other people disagree, is that it's just really easy to provoke people. Like, people around the environment react very harshly, very quickly. So you bump into somebody, and they're like, hey, and they pull a gun on you. And the first time I would run away or try to diffuse a situation, right? And then eventually I got tired of doing that because I kept getting in trouble, and I just started shooting people. And once I shot 3 or 4 or 5 people in the game, I no longer felt any responsibility for my character's bad behavior. In fact, now what I do to make up for it is I feed my horse oats and donate money to my camp, because you get honor points for that. And if people are stranded in the wilderness, I help them. But I'll tell you, I will shoot any settler, right? And if I lose a game of poker, rob the person. It's fine, And so you can look at how each one of these things sort of seems to suggest how much psychological merging you're having. So let's say that my value system is being honest and fair, and I feel like I'm in control of my character, and I accept my character's world, or my avatar's world, as a reality, and I feel an identification with the avatar, I would have a high level of psychological merging. I wouldn't see much of a distinction between me and the person on screen. We're the same person. And then, of course, on the other side, I could have lower levels of these things. And if I have lower levels of these things, there would not be psychological merging, and I would not feel a strong sense of attachment. And we found that this thing could predict how you play. It could predict your tendencies. So as you can probably imagine, people with really high sense of care tended to be more pro-social, and people with a really low sense of care were less pro-social. And, I won't go into some of the details here, but the point was, we kind of thought this was the answer. Well, it's an avatar. It's on screen. I'm in charge. And so maybe what research should be doing is just looking at the extent to which myself and my avatar have been merged, or we stay separate. And it was just kind of a single dimension. You know, and I'm sure everybody on this call has played a game where you didn't really feel any connection to the avatar, and maybe you've played some games where you felt a strong connection. What do you think? Have you had those experiences before? Oh, one way or the other, just like no connection at all versus a strong connection.
I felt pretty connected to Arthur Morgan in a sense from Red Dead 2. I didn't feel specifically like, oh man, he's just like me, but I understood his struggles and I understood why he was doing the actions that he was doing, and by extension, I also could understand why I personally would do the things such as rob somebody for money. I was like, yeah, Arthur would do this. I understand why he would do this, and I'm the one taking control of him and having him do this.
And in fact, what you just pointed out ended up being one of the problems in this particular focus, is that some people do what you just said. They're like, well, I don't know if I would do it, but I know that he would do it. Like, in his world, it makes perfect sense. He's a bandit at the end of the day. He might be an honorable bandit, but he's still a bandit, right? There's even some storylines. I remember there's one where you can rob homesteads, but the characters always seem to give you a reason for it. Like, oh, well, they're crooked homesteaders, right? They rob from other people and they kidnap people. So it's okay to rob them because, you know. And then, of course, in the game, right, there was always this struggle between right and wrong. And you were always kind of in the liminal space between those two things. And that conversation around what you would do versus what the avatar would do, this becomes interesting. And of course, keep in mind that, like all of the constructs in this class, none of them are binaries. So it's not like you're either merged or you're not merged. It's that there are degrees of merging that exist on these dimensions. So like listening to Alex talk sounds like pretty high sense of disbelief, like no worries that, you know, yeah, I get the world. It makes sense to me. I'm not critiquing it, right? Pretty high sense of control, you know, fairly decent level of like, I'm responsible for the actions, but there's also a little bit of like, the character has their own. And then, like you said, a little bit of identification. Not like we're the same person, but I see some character traits in common.
I personally would never kill somebody for 63 cents.
Right.
I don't know about you guys.
I definitely do it all the time in that game. I don't think I would do it in reality. Right? And in fact, that's going to come up later when we talk about other dimensions here. So we thought this was the answer. And then that was the end of the story. That it's character attachment. It's the extent to which, and again, we weren't even using the word avatar yet. We were just talking about characters. And this goes back, 2000, that's 12 years ago. Well, then we noticed that in some games, the avatar does talk back. The avatar almost seems to have its own motivations and story and background. And this sounds a little weird to lots of folks. And then I bring up this device. Anybody ever have one of these? You take it out of its shell.
Tamagotchi?
Yeah. Describe how these Tamagotchis work. This is a Gudetama one because it's the best one ever. But describe how these Tamagotchis work. Yeah, walk me through that. Obviously not an avatar, but, how does it work?
It's a virtual pet that works on a timer, and you have to do certain actions at set times, such as feed it, I think play with it. I'm not certain about it. I never had one myself.
Yeah, those two are probably the most common. Are there other ones I'm missing? So there's feeding it, there's playing with it. That may have been it for some of the early ones. You had to walk it. Yeah. The Poke one was an example of that. You give it exercise. And if you didn't do these things, what would happen?
It would die.
It would die. And of course, you just reset it and play again. Although, man, what a great scheme to make some money if you had permadeath Tamagotchis. I mean, you could make a lot of cash with like an eBay store where like, oh, that's it. You got to buy a new one. $15, right? And I have a suspicion that you probably could, maybe we found a way to make some money. Just you have to download a new like a new blockchain code to reactivate the Tamagotchi. Yeah, and like Lindsay's talking about, like, yeah, they died, and like sometimes people will be upset. You feel guilty about it. And then of course you also had like the Sims effect, right, where people just torture the thing. And actually, The Sims is another great example. Describe the Sims gameplay to me for folks who have played it before. Like, what's your role in that game?
Well, you're either trying to make a stable household or trying to find ways to torture your Sims for that. Those are the only real two ways to play the game.
And there's lots of YouTube videos where folks will like lock their Sims in a house, remove all the doors and windows, and take the toilet out, and just like see what happens in the Sim. There's some crazy stuff in the Sims. If you've ever seen like Sims torture video plays, and of course these things have something in common. Who's really in charge of gameplay here? I mean, yes, you get to click the buttons, but who's in charge? I could argue, and like if anybody on this call has a pet, I could argue that you're not necessarily in charge of this relationship. Like, you're compelled to do things for this other object, or it suffers. Do you own your pet? Maybe, right? We could split the phenomenological hairs there. But one of the arguments for this particular model was that, why are we assuming that the player is always in control? Because there could be lots of times, Alex somewhat foreshadowed it when he talked about like what Arthur would do. Because even to say that recognizes that there's another person in this equation. And that character has their own name, their own motivations, their own backstory, their own desires. And so whether it's just like a weird little egg barking at you if you don't feed it, all the way up to a fully formed digital other who pushes back and talks with you, we could really debate some of these things. And so one of the things we tried to understand in research was something called a player-avatar relationship. And this comes from Dr. Banks's work, who's also in the college here. And she essentially settled through a series of interviews with gamers and surveys. I think this research now has something like 4,000 to 5,000 different participants in different studies and different versions, different cultures. In fact, I gave you a bonus reading, and it wasn't necessarily to dig deeply into, but it's a version of this research that has been translated into Mandarin Chinese for our Taiwanese students and into German. And what we're doing is we're seeing that these different dimensions hold up in different cultures, which is always interesting from a research perspective, because sometimes so much of the research we do comes from one culture, and there could be things unique to that culture that would not replicate other places. So the fact that we're seeing this in different parts of the world starts to give evidence that it's happening. So what she argues is that there might be 4 different kinds of relationships. And the important thing for this is that not all of them are about psychological merging. And that's really the key. Her argument basically was that this was short-sighted. Not that this is wrong. People definitely merge psychologically with their avatars. They have this character attachment. But it's not the case that you could explain all gameplay using this approach. And this might become even more relevant in virtual reality when we start trying to simulate non-gaming environments that are populated with digital objects and digital people. We saw a lot of this in Second Life, for example, before we actually had the immersive turn, right? And of course, social VR is sort of, I think, the next killer app. There's been a lot of suggestions that what will make VR take off is probably not video games. It's probably social VR. Because gaming is a bit too limited. And there's still some debates around, like, VR games are cool, but they still seem to be somewhat gimmicky compared to just games broadly. Whereas social VR simulates an experience that is very novel. to actually embody different people in different spaces. And we can talk about that as we go through today's conversation. But this model here argues for 4 different categories. And understand that when we talk about categories, it's always a bit tough because the boundary conditions around these categories are not always very thick, and we don't necessarily know where the breaks are. It's almost more like typologies or even heuristics for 4 different ways that people, in fact, in a lot of this research, we talk about these in terms of heuristic categories. So if you ask somebody to classify their gameplay in a different, in these different categories, they can usually tell you one of 4 pretty stably. So the first one is called avatar as object. And the idea behind avatar as object is that your avatar is a collection of pixels, and that's it. I don't really get invested. I don't care. The only reason I have any relationship with my avatar is I want to play a video game. And I can't do that unless I make my avatar do stuff. Right? So, in a lot of early like platformers, for example, you know, the designers were not often trying to get you to feel a close, deep connection with like Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog or Crash Bandicoot or any, name the character who jumps around things, right? That wasn't really the important part of the game. In fact, when we say platformers, what are we focusing on inherently? Are we focusing on the characters? Like, what's that word even imply?
You're focusing on the gameplay.
Gameplay. Yeah. Yeah, the whole... And in fact, if we go back even further, a lot of the research on genre categorizations, there's been some arguments that genres in 2020 are really, really not yet useful. Because if you go back and look at genre categorizations like in the 80s and 90s, they were largely associated with ludic dimensions, like how you play the game, puzzle, adventure, platformer, shooter. But in 2020, like, what's Red Dead Redemption 2? Like, is it a shooter? Is it a horse simulator? Is it a MMO? Like, there's so many different blendings there.
That's the thing with Red Dead is like it's a combination of a lot of things. It's basically, you can say, an Old West story with trying to simulate as many aspects about it, like horse care.
Some people have even argued that genres may have to start incorporating narrative elements now too, because as you go towards narrative, that might be the distinction. Because although like that game and Grand Theft Auto 5 on their face have a lot in common, you know, they have a lot of things not in common. So it's a really strange conversation that actually we'll bring up later because Jared asked about genre differences in these categories. But the idea behind the object orientation is that there really is no investment. So the focus of play tends to be combat and competition. I'm trying to win a game. I'm playing a game. I'm trying to win. My pixels on screen are my pixels on screen. I don't really care. We talked earlier in class about folks who, for example, will play first-person shooters competitively, and sometimes they'll even turn off the graphics or turn them down really low. Why might that be an example of somebody with an object orientation?
He's more focused, like you know, he's more focused on achieving the goal and stuff.
Like, you don't even care about what the game looks like, right?
Right.
Alex, they'll turn off they'll turn the resolution down, turn off texturing, like anything you can do to like make that game run faster, right? And of course, the idea there is that person's so uninvested in the environment, in the narrative, in the context, in the characters. All they will focus on is trying to win. Again, nothing wrong with that. It's just that that's an orientation we take. You know, I play Super Mario 35 all the time. I'm not invested in my character. I'm invested in me. And Mario is just my avenue towards success in an online world, right? If you look at this chart... go ahead.
I was going to say, I think I can answer one of my questions here.
Sure.
This, avatar's object. So, We talk about the four types of relationships with avatar as object being one of them, plus the others. And this may be a question for both of the class, but also maybe for you, Mr. Bowman, since you're knowledgeable about the subject. Could this similar concepts be applied to, let's say, another medium, like let's say film, like particularly with the avatar as object? It's like, oh, they're just a means to get the job done or the gameplay. And then maybe that could be applied to film, like let's say with the character who is only there for the sake of moving a plot line forward, or maybe in a horror film just the sake to die.
I think there could be some connections. Of course, the hard part is all of this is written around interactivity. And so all the arguments are associated with this notion of, I'm in control to a relative degree. For example, that notion of agency is what makes it hard. So, for example, when I'm talking about object, these are players who have a very high sense of agency. They're in charge. They have a very low intimacy. They don't really care about the relationship. And differentiation, they don't distinguish between themselves and the avatar, because the avatar is an extension of their agency. They just don't care about the avatar. The avatar is basically a hammer. It's a tool, right? And the reason it would be tough not being able to talk about it in film would be the agency part. Now, that doesn't mean there may not be some semantic similarities between how audiences connect with different characters in a film. So I could see an idea around the notion of I invest in some characters more than others for various reasons. And that could be something to talk about. But I think the tough part would be the agency part. So I wouldn't throw the idea out the door. But that would be the rough edge, is that I think all of this is written from the presumption that A, you're doing the creating, and B, you can touch things at any time. Now, that being said, but from a director's position, maybe it's different, because in a way, you are in charge. You're the one literally putting people in different places. So I never thought of the idea of looking at it from the writers or the producers or the director's perspective, where in some way, and of course we know that the characters in a film represent the writers, or they can rather. They don't have to, but that could be interesting. I've never thought of, and that could be curious.
It is quite something. The writers in turn basically get to determine exactly how the story plays out.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some little bit there, but I get the difference.
I think from the audience perspective, it'd be hard. I think from the creator's perspective, which, by the way, we don't have very much media psychology research on the creators themselves. We have almost none. They make stuff and then we study it. And I wish we had a lot more, because I think we could learn more about these processes if we understood the process of creation better. So we should talk about that. But I think the object players make sense. And probably many of us have played games with an object orientation. Just playing, don't care. I know there are games I play where I skip the story. I just do not care. I'm totally uninterested. And I hit that button and I mash it until it lets me move on to the next chapter. I'm stop talking, don't care, moving on. You might make fun of me, but as much as I enjoy Kojima's writing, there are some times in Metal Gear Solid where I'm you got to stop telling me stuff. I just had this awesome mech fight. I just want to go back to it, and I don't want to know why. I want to put claymores in the ground and fight snipers. That's what I want to do. And I know one thing personally I've noticed is that more recent games feel like they have really long intros. Where I buy the game, I put it in my PlayStation, and there's 20 minutes to load it, and that's fine. But then there's a half-hour intro. I was playing Kingdom Hearts 3 about a month ago, and I like Kingdom Hearts, but I had to watch an entire music video. And I'm this is a great video. I just want to use my Keyblade and hit things. Look, this is not that deep of a story. It is actually, but I like the action RPG genre. I don't need to have that much motivation to walk forward. I'm playing the game because I like Disney and I like Square, and I just want to see the movies in action. And I just remember that happened quite a bit. So anyway, from an object orientation, all that stuff's irrelevant and not important. I just want to play. We're going to skip the me's for a little bit. On the other side of the scale, we have the other orientation. These are people who see their avatar as a legitimate social other, as a separate being with its own world, its own motivations, its own thoughts and feelings and desires. They tend to very, very much separate themselves. So there's me and there's my avatar, and we are not the same thing. This is the opposite of psychological merging. Very, very intimate relationship, meaning that I'm emotionally involved. I'm emotionally invested. Like, I know this character very well. These players don't feel as if they're the ones in charge of the game. That in many ways, the avatar is in charge of the game. And the player's job is to make sure the avatar gets what it needs. Like that Tamagotchi, or, like that sim. Okay.
I would say that maybe that's the approach maybe Red Dead takes, because you're seeing it as another person, like it's its own social thing. Because yes, you are playing as Arthur, but Arthur's his own person, and although you can control his actions a little bit in regards to him, he I think the game makes it very clear, like he's a person who has his own traits, his own personality, and that kind of deal. And that's how I feel when I play Red Dead. Is I'm here controlling him, but he is different from me.
Yeah, and that's what makes this stuff interesting, right? Is that you start seeing some bending here, where, like for me, it's believe it or not, sports games, where sometimes I'll play as me, right? And I'll make my character and I'll go through. But listen, folks, when I play NBA, you know how many MVP awards I've made in for the Houston Rockets? But that's not me. I'm 5'8" and 200 pounds. I'm not doing this. But if you turn it on easy, you can. But then there are also times where I will play as a team and try to play their way, right? And try to play using their book and their plays and what I know from the sports page, and I'll walk through it that way. And like you said, Javier, it's almost like a simulation. Yeah, I'm pushing the buttons, but the fun of the simulation is actually playing them, And we see this in a lot of games, right? And in fact, part of what makes all this wild are the symbiotes. And if you notice, they're in between the me's and the others, and this ends up changing a little later. But essentially what's going on are these are people who kind of do both. They play as them, but they recognize the player as somebody else. The avatar as somebody else. And they borrow both. Sometimes they make their decisions. Sometimes they make Arthur's decisions. Or they might deliberate what Arthur would do, but their version of what Arthur would do, and then from there decide, okay, let's try doing this, right? And then finally, the me's, in a way we've already talked about them, right? These are the psychological mergers. These are the people that go into the environment as them. They create an avatar, they take up an avatar as them. There's no difference. So, this ordering here is not meant to rank worst to best or anything like that. But what it's meant to sort of rank is these dimensions. And so these people have more agency, less intimacy, and less self-differentiation, because these people have at least done some merging. So they've kind of collected some things. They do feel an emotional connection to the avatar because it's them. And they don't distinguish at all because they're literally the same unit, right? So object, me, symbiote, other seem to be 4 consistent categories that people put themselves in when they're playing with these different avatars. Out of curiosity, which one do you think occurs the most often? In all this research, one of these categories occurs the most often. What do you think? Somebody guessed the me, and me occurred a lot, but it wasn't the most often.
From my personal experience, I would say object.
Object, definitely. Object was like almost half gamers. And then me was right behind it. Symbiote and other don't happen that often. At least in our data. Okay. Keeping in mind, some of this data was on MMOs, where you would expect me and other to be kind of popular. But no, a lot of folks play MMOs and they're playing to grind it out. They're just playing to advance their levels. There's even a great book called Elite Noobs from Mark Chin. He's a professor in Washington. And he studies the sort of the evolution and de-evolution of elite WoW players. And what he talks about is, as they play for years, they get so good, kind of what Jared's talking about, that they end up playing more as a task. Gameplay is just a way to sharpen your skills, a way to help other people improve their skills, and just grind it out because they've mastered it. They've mastered it. And you see this with a lot of other like elite players where, you know, the story is not what's motivating them. It's not the deep connection they have to their, you know, they may have a deep connection to their character, to their avatar, but it's more in the way a soldier has a connection to their weapon. Right? This is the thing that I use to kick ass. And it was an interesting conversation. And in fact, where some people sort of burn out is where a game that started off maybe as a me or another shifts over to an object, and then you just sort of lose interest in the larger bits. And we can, of course, debate those things. But object and me, by far the most common. I used to know the exact number breakdown, and I'm forgetting it right now. But these two absolutely were the most common ones you would see out there. Symbiote and other rarely happened, but did happen. It happened enough. I want to say like in the low teens, you know, percentage-wise. Okay. Some of the stuff, we kind of already talked about this, how they clash a little bit. Now, one of the things we tried to do is put them together because this perspective and this perspective don't match up. One argues it's always merging, and one argues it's differentiation. And these things were very difficult to sort of tease out. And one of the things we did is found some patterns of language. So you would probably expect identification to be highest for the me players, wouldn't you? Like, these are the people who psychologically merged. Well, if you're psychologically merging, then you're definitely going to expect identification to be highest for me players. For suspension of disbelief, why do you think it was highest for the others as opposed to like object and me and symbiote? So others had the highest levels of suspension of disbelief. What might explain that finding? Any idea?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Why would it be the case? So what this chart is showing is when people talked about their avatar, they used language that fit into these different categories. And it seemed like when people talked about suspension of disbelief, they were most likely to talk about it when they were having an avatar as other relationship as compared to the other ones. And why might that be the case?
Probably because when you play as somebody else, you head into it knowing that you are not in 100% control of that avatar or character's actions. Such as Arthur Morgan, when I started Red Dead Redemption 2, I knew I would be shooting people in the face and taking their money. And I knew if I were playing an RPG like Fallout, then I'd be able to make a decision to not do that and still succeed at my mission. I knew that Red Dead would be a linear story where I don't get to decide what's going to happen at the end of the day. I get to decide intermediary things. But I'm still involved with Arthur Morgan, and I can still feel connected to him.
I think that is on the right track, no question. how can we talk about it though? So the idea here would be people who felt the other orientation were the ones that were the most willing to accept the character's world, right? So I think the things that you're talking about would play into that. But at a broader level, the idea, I think, would be, well, if I don't accept the character's world as a real one, then how could I possibly accept the character as a legitimate social actor, right? Those two things kind of come together. Because like, it wouldn't make sense to say, well, Arthur Morgan's real, but his world's bullshit, right? Like, they have to add up. In fact, in some ways, maybe you could even argue what makes the character seem real is they live in a deep narrative world. So, like, you have all this background information and all of this, like, you know, narrative structures, friendships. There's so much context that as you accept that context, you also accept this character. And then, of course, if you're trying to understand the character's own motivations, well, motivations don't even make sense unless their world also makes sense, right? Because, of course, you could play that game through an object orientation, right? All this stuff is unimportant. Hold down X, skip the story. I just want a rifle. I don't want to shoot people. And if I push L2 and R2, I can do that as quickly as possible. So I think at a more basic level, there's probably this interaction between because this character, or, you know, because I'm willing to accept that world, that character is much more likely to exist on its own. The idea of going to bed and then turning the game off, that's kind of interesting, right? I'm going to put my character in bed and then log out so that when I log back in the next day, I'm going to wake up in the same place because my character was sleeping when I was logged out. Sort of recognizes that the character is its own other thing. And that is logically consistent in the world, right? So sense of control was very much about object players. How could that work? So people who felt a really strong sense of physical control over their character were by far the most likely to have an object orientation. Walk me through that notion.
It's probably because, you know, like it wouldn't work as well in the simulator thriller because we have, like, humans usually have a sense of compassion, and, you know, when you have a sense of control, like, you know, like, the more control is like, if you were to do that as a social worker, you may feel more bad about it, you know, like having a character, an avatar in a game do things that you may feel bad about them doing, or, you know, that deal. But if you view the avatar as an object, let's say not a social actor, just as a thing in the game to get something done, you're way more probably likely to be fine exerting more control over it, if that makes sense.
I think you're right. Yeah, it's that all I'm really focusing on is gameplay, probably. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, all I care about is, like, I'm in control, great. And so when I talk about my avatar, well, I don't see them as a social actor. I don't see them as me. All I see them as is like a thing to get things done. And so my discussions around my avatar are probably just going to be focused on, like, you know, jump, shoot, run, those below the neck verbs, right? Because what else would I talk about? Like, nothing else in this environment really compels me in any way, right? And then likewise, the sense of responsibility. It kind of makes sense that that would be highest for the other people, right? I don't feel responsible for me. And I really don't care about object. Responsibility there just means, like, push button, make things happen. But of course, at this far end, if I'm feeling this avatar's other association, well, then what's probably going on is that I feel like I care about this thing. Like, I really got to take care of this thing. I got to make sure Arthur's okay. And by the way, for folks on the call today, if the references to the game aren't making sense, please feel free to ask. Fortunately, I think it's abstract enough to where it doesn't even matter if you've played or not. Because in some ways, we're talking about a character named Arthur, and he lives in the Wild West, right? And that's sort of the context of what we're talking about today. But I'm happy to clarify or mix it up or move that around a little bit. So this was a language analysis. And what I'm pointing out is we found stable connections between an idea of merging and an idea of diverging, where the ideas themselves didn't really connect with each other from a theoretical perspective, but the players did see connections between the two concepts. You know, these different concepts of merging had different patterns associated with these different relationship categories. And then I won't spend too much time on this one, except to suggest that one of the things that we noticed is that as players, well, actually, I'm going to scrap this one because we've since argued against this. So I'm literally just going to delete it from the slides. Okay, not going to bog you down with the data necessarily, but what I want to show you is essentially what happened. So these were the character attachment dimensions, and these were the player avatar relationship bits. And what we saw are that the numbers in here, which represent the correlations between the two concepts, were larger than the numbers out here, which were the correlations within both concepts. In other words, this was people talking and we saw overlap. This was folks filling out surveys and we saw overlap. And what we think happened is essentially there was a blending. There was a blending of ideas. And what we eventually arrived at was this different scale that tries to measure the player avatar interaction. So what we think is going on when we're talking about avatars is there are 4 things that broadly represent how we associate. So again, character attachment wasn't quite good enough. It was too focused on the me people. And we had to find a better way to explain everybody. And these categories did a great job of broadening out the heuristics of your relationship. I keep saying heuristic. What does that word mean, just to remind me? When someone says they're talking about a heuristic, what are they?
Enabling someone to learn or discover something for themselves.
Ish. It's definitely about cognitive processing. But one idea behind a heuristic is that it's about almost shortcutting. Heuristics are going to be sort of quick assessments, quick judgments we can make that allow us to sort of very rapidly describe an experience without elaborating too much on it. So I don't know if I would say learning necessarily, but I think I would say something more along the lines of, by having these heuristics, we can quickly make an assessment without having to go into too much detail. So if you ask a player very quickly, they could categorize their avatar into one of these 4 things. But the problem with the heuristic is that they're shortcuts. They're not super elaborate. They're not super deep. And, you know, sometimes our heuristics don't match our realities. You know, a lot of people would argue that stereotyping is a form of heuristic, right? You make a quick judgment based on somebody, based on seeing something very fast, but you haven't actually spent any time elaborating on this one. Okay? Let's see. So if I go a little further, these items were meant to be sort of like your way of making a more specific assessment of that heuristic category you put people into. One of them, emotional investment. So one way we can assess the player-avatar interaction is by how much emotion does the player put into the avatar. So the avatar is very special to me. I don't care about the avatar. I don't have an emotional connection to the avatar. I'd be heartbroken if I lost this avatar. I appreciate the avatar. I love the avatar. And the language is a bit odd. Remember that when you're measuring constructs, you're not trying to measure the same thing 6 different times. You're trying to measure different slices of the thing that fit into a larger construct. I'm going to pull the paper real quick to kind of give a very brief illustration of what I'm talking about there. Because this is something that's kind of important to understand scales. You've done scales probably in studies before. And it's not always super clear why they're worded the way they're worded. Oops, that's the wrong one. Sorry. Let's see here. Thanks for being patient. Here we go. So I just published a manuscript recently talking about like literally how to build scales and how to measure them. And one of the things that we presented in this paper, ignore all that, that's just the edits we had to make. And that was a lot. So like whenever you get feedback from your professors, by the way, here's what feedback from a journal looks like. Here are all the things I had to fix with this paper before they would publish it. So we get yelled at too. And some of them are APA mistakes. So we make APA mistakes too. This here.
I got a little comment that I think is kind of interesting.
What's that?
Just a little comment here.
Let me finish out this example first, and then I'll come to it. Okay.
Okay.
So when you're measuring something, like you have this thing, enjoyment you're trying to measure. But there's lots of ways to measure enjoyment, right? You can ask questions. You could fill in blanks. You can answer questions. You could answer surveys. You could watch somebody playing something and see how they react. You could measure their body reactions. And even within these things, like I have to ask lots of questions because enjoyment could be like enjoyable, fun, arousing, exciting. Those are all different slices of enjoyment. And then, of course, the idea is that those things overlap and then as a collection represent this broader construct. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Go ahead.
Something interesting I was thinking about is how sometimes in regards to like avatar relationship, like while I was doing the reading, something that came to mind is how sometimes I can see it in like game advertising. Like, for example, in regards to the Batman Arkham game, the tagline for like the game was "Be the Batman," you know, as in you're going to play as the Batman, as this character that we all know and love, you know. So, you know, if there's some like legitimacy there because I think some games like to advertise, you know, like you becoming or you gain to play as this character, you know.
Yeah. So I think that's a very common tactic of advertising, I think. You know, in fact, in a lot of the early, more sandbox type games, I think that was a pretty common line, right? It was like, you get to do everything, right? But of course, what's funny about that is just because you're invested or you're being Batman doesn't necessarily mean you're emotionally involved, right? I mean, you could just be Batman because Batman knows karate and has a cool tool belt, right? Or you could be Batman because you know a lot about Batman's backstory, and as a result, you're trying to really figure out, you know, what it is about the character's motivations, and would you be the same vigilante they would be, right? Is that the connection you were going for?
Yeah, you know, in a way. So it can be different for different reasons compared to the people, because some may do it because they want, you know, they like the fighting style of the game or whatever, but some may be because, oh, I have an emotional connection to Batman. I read the comics, watched the movies and stuff, and it'd be so cool to be able to play as him and do all this stuff.
One thing you're pointing out right now, and it relates to one of Jared's questions, and I get it all the time, is that, well, don't these vary by genre? And we're finding out that they really don't. You would expect them to. But the players can pretty much play how they want to in a lot of games. And then the player motivations are so different that we're actually not noticing a lot of variation between like genres or correlation between genre types and avatar player types. But one reason we think it's happening is that our current definitions of genres aren't very good.
Right, regards to gaming genres, you mean?
Yeah, they're just not very. They don't do a good job of distinguishing the types of things they used to distinguish. Again, you know, what is sandbox? Is that really? I mean, that's a genre, but it doesn't really it focuses on gameplay, right? And it gets tricky. We're actually finding that in early data analysis with a colleague of mine at Wisconsin, we're finding that with retro games, it seems to be really easy to tease out genres. But with modern games, it seems to be much more difficult. And we're using a machine learning program where we're having like thousands of people make comparisons between games. Some of you on the call may have done this for a survey I posted in Discord. Well, over 100,000 trials, we could take all those human pairs And then we can look at the patterns across all those pairs to see if the computer can classify the pairs into groups. And what we found for modern games, there were like 2 genres, and they were racing and rhythm. And then every other game basically just like fit into a big pie. It was like, and then there's games. What's that?
Yeah, that does.
And it kind of makes sense, right? Those are 2 games where, for the most part, they're pretty clear on what they do, right? And then all the other games were all over the place. But then with the retro games, at least in our early analysis, we're seeing that they distinguish pretty clearly, like platformers, RPGs. Those ones aren't struggling nearly as much to differentiate between each other because the gameplay conventions were a little bit different at the time. And in fact, one thing we might wonder, which I've not seen this research before, is that maybe this PAX and PAR stuff from today, I'm not sure how applicable it would be to old games. Or maybe it would be. That would be an interesting question, you know, because newer games give you so many more choices and they confuse so many more conventions that it's not clear if these things would replicate from one version of these games to the next. But anyway, the first category I found was emotional investment. And that one's pretty clear. And again, you don't have to get too way down in these numbers, but if you're interested, these numbers here are called factor loadings. They're how strongly does this one sentence predict variance in this one concept. As they get closer to 1, it's a better predictor. As they get closer to 0, it's a worse predictor. And usually we use a cutoff of 0.6, and I can explain that some other time. For the second one, it's kind of a complicated word, anthropomorphic autonomy. And what it essentially refers to is how human I think the avatar is. And it's, in a way, it's like humanness being it's on its own. It had its own thoughts and feelings. It had its own ideas. It's autonomous, acts on its own. When I log out, the avatar has its own thing, right? We didn't want to call this personification because that has very different implications. But basically, does it have its own humanness independent from me? Okay. And then humanness is tough because not all human, right? Down below, this one didn't change. Suspension of disbelief, same thing. And it's mostly about error checking, right? Do things add up? And then sense of control. Does it do what I want it to do? Right? Why is this interesting? Well, what ends up happening is that 2 of these seem to be more about social mechanics. Emotional investment, anthropomorphic autonomy. So some of this player avatar connection has a lot to do with seeing the avatar as a social other. Essentially a human. And the other 2, these aren't laid out very well, sorry. Let me find a better way of putting this. I'll go back up here. These first 2 were a heck of a lot more about being human. And the second 2, down below, were a lot more about focusing on the game. You can't focus on one without the other, right? And how I go to your question earlier, this is where it gets tough to apply to film because the control part wouldn't apply. The disbelief part would apply, but the control part wouldn't, right?
Right.
That's where this stuff became interesting. Okay. This is just a bunch of ideas about like why does any of this matter? We found that people with really high emotional attachment were much more likely to play for social reasons. That makes sense. They're emotionally invested in their avatar. They're going to play for social reasons. Okay. Incidentally, you have to accept the avatar's game world is real to be motivated to play for social reasons. It wouldn't make sense to go into Azeroth and talk to people if you didn't accept Azeroth as a real place. It wouldn't make any sense to do that, right? if we look at things like immersion experiences, and this is, I hate this word because it was used wrong here. Okay. But same thing. Like, you would expect people with high emotional investment and high suspension of disbelief to feel more like they were involved in the game world. Right? That makes sense. And we'll talk about some of the genre stuff here in a little bit. Oh, actually, we did find a couple of unique differences. So emotional investment was really, really high in open world games. Why might that make sense? And in fact, emotional investment and sense of disbelief were high in open world games.
Because you make the choice that, well, you make every choice your character does,
right,
as opposed to a linear game where the story is preset. Your ending can be decided by your actions, therefore your character is usually an extension of you, the player, just placed into that world.
Well, and in that, and I might go even a little further and say, you know, that's true, but it could also be the case that if it's a real world, I even accept the character's role in that world, right? So it both represents me, but I can also make decisions for the character itself, right? Like, I can learn Arthur's motivations and then try to figure out how to get him towards whatever end state of things. But in either way, I think it makes sense what you're arguing, right? And if you accept the open world as like a legitimate open space where things happen and things matter and decisions have consequences, you're also probably going to be emotionally invested in those decisions, right? And so we did see that break. By the way, in arena games, PvP, suspension of disbelief, super low. Is suspension of disbelief even remotely important for a PvP? It doesn't matter if it's real. Not really.
Not really.
Yeah, I don't like critique Street Fighter 2 for being ludicrous. You can't just fly from Brazil to India and fight a yogi. I don't care, right? I have my character, you have your character, and my job is to beat you up. You know, when I'm playing Overwatch, I don't get upset because the environments are fake. Or like, they're inconsistent. Now, you might get mad if they affect the gameplay, right? But you're not overly invested in like accepting. In fact, does Overwatch have a narrative? I'm sure it probably does. There's probably some reason why we're fighting each other.
Overwatch does not have a narrative, but the upcoming Overwatch 2 is supposed to be narrative.
So how interesting is that? Overwatch, no, there's no attempt. They're like, you're shooting each other.
It's not that there's no narrative, it's that it is in a world that has a narrative, but the game itself does not. So characters exist, and they exist, and their personalities are created through supplemental materials such as shorts or comics or dev blogs, and but they do not really exist in game.
And
you
Phil's
don't play the game, and your characters talk to each other in dialogue.
And Phil's mentioning the same thing. And why is it the case that most people can play that game have no knowledge of these backstories? In fact, they are backstories, they are shorts, they're often external, they're almost irrelevant to gameplay. Why is that?
Well, because it's a pointy shooting game.
Yeah, it's
you don't have to care about that.
Now, if you want to be a fan, you certainly can, right? And you could get involved in these transmediated aspects of the story. But you don't have to, right? In fact, there may not be any benefit to getting emotionally connected to a character. You know, and actually Phil's pointing out the idea, because you're right, Blizzard's lore crafters are really good, right? And so they put the same amount of investment in those choices. Because, I mean, like, different characters, you know, have different sexual orientations in a video game that has nothing to do with anything except shooting each other, right? And in fact, you're probably the reason why they're coming out with a narrative version is because there is a really cool, like, set of stories here, but they're probably irrelevant to a pointy shooting, right? And that becomes really interesting to think about, you know, and the fact that they can launch it originally and we're like, whatever, there's 12 characters, they're kind of neat, let's just do this thing, you know, fun times, you know, and that doesn't surprise us that suspension of disbelief wouldn't be that important for PvP, right? The reason we think we found emotional investment to be really low, it was this really like sci-fi RPG genre, was that it was mostly Eve Online. And so, yeah, if you're emotionally invested in Eve, you're just going to have a bad time, right? It's a pretty cutthroat game. Moving forward a little bit. We fixed a couple items, you know. I forget my own feelings, take on those of my character. I enjoy pretending that my character is a real person. I consider my character a friend. I enjoy pretending I am, you know, things of that nature. But what's particularly interesting here, we think, is this. So what's on this chart are what we found in just sort of a quick literature search. All these different terms that we see in the literature that people refer to avatars as. Toy, tool, puppet, object, possession, prop, vehicle, project, resource, costume, archive, performance, challenge, mask, role, symbol, story, charm, extension, representation, piece of me, mirror, identity, personality, partner, person. In all sorts of studies, we see these words used over and over and over again. We call it construct sprawl or construct proliferation. And what happens in research is different researchers start studying their own thing. And as they do that, what ends up happening is those words come to mean something. And so the toy scholar and the puppet scholar argue they're studying different things. Or the extension person and the mirror person argue that they're studying different things. So one of the things that we did is we took all of these words, and in a survey we asked players, okay, tell us how strong you would rank these. And we asked every single one. We randomized them and just said, here you go. Think about your avatar. Tell us a story about your avatar. From that story, tell us how you feel in terms of, is that avatar a toy, an object, a vehicle, a resource, a costume, etc., etc., etc. You kind of see where all this is going. And then we asked them one question. Is how strong, like, do you have a human-like connectedness with your avatar? Basically, do you see your avatar like you see another person in your life? And as you can guess, the average score on that question was not very high. This is like a 1 to 7 scale, 3.8, which is kind of in the middle. For those of you who understand stats, standard deviation of 2.8. So it not only means the scores are in the middle, but there's a lot of spread here. There's a lot of variation. So there are people scoring 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the scores are kind of all over the place. Which you would kind of expect if it is the case that there are 4 different categories, right? Because if there's 1,000 people in a survey and they fall into these different categories, well, if I ask somebody who has an object orientation whether or not they felt a human-like connectedness with their avatar, what would they answer? Would their scores be low or high? So I ask him.
Probably high.
I asked them about a human-like connectedness. Like literally, like you see your avatar like you see people in your life. And I'm asking somebody who basically plays for competition and combat.
They would definitely say no then.
Yeah, they'd be like, nope. They'd be like, that's a stupid question. In fact, some people would score 1 and be like, that's a dumb question. Right? Like, my avatar is a gun. I don't care. You know, my avatar is a tank. I don't care. Right? And if I asked an other, do you see your avatar like a human? They'd be like, well, yeah. Like, Arthur Morgan's Arthur Morgan. Like, literally, I see him as a authentic, separate person. And then the people in the middle would have scores in the middle. Because if you're a me player, you wouldn't score 7 because it's not a different person in your life, it's you. But you might score in the middle. And the symbiotes are also kind of in the middle. So we already expected a ton of variation on those scores. We didn't expect them to be distributed normally, per se. Why is it important? Well, this ranking here was not the ranking from the literature. This is how we ranked them. So we calculated correlations for all of these. And we did some adjustments to protect against statistical inflation. And the point is, we then laid out the correlations from lowest to highest. Remember, correlations can go from -1 all the way to +1. Negative correlations mean as one score goes up, one score goes down. Positive correlations meaning as one score goes up, the other score goes up. We get both of these things in research. And they're both informative. Negative doesn't necessarily mean bad. It just means inverse relationship. Well, as you'd probably expect, and as what Alex said a moment ago, the higher my human-like connectedness score, the lower my toy, tool, puppet, and object scores were. And the higher my human-like connectedness scores were, the higher my extension, representation, me, mirror, identity, partner, person scores were. And if you look within these clusters, they didn't differ from each other. So the correlation of negative 0.272 and 0.258 pretty much cluster around each other. They don't differ. In other words, what we argued is that this R scheme for object orientations, me orientations, all the ones in blue, and green and person and partner, which ones do you think those are? My avatar is a separate person, my avatar is a partner. Which orientation fits those? Of the 4 listed here.
The other?
Other, absolutely. Well, turns out those individual ideas basically broke into smaller groups, and they followed our continuum almost exactly. And so one of the things that we think this research has solved is we got to stop talking about these individual 36 things. We're really talking about a couple of things. We're talking about objects. We're talking about me's. We're talking about others. You notice symbiotes didn't pop up on here. And that's not too surprising to us because symbiotes, we argue, kind of fall in here. Remember that the category there is sort of a merging of both. Okay? And in fact, this is not as clear, but this one is very clear. In fact, one of the anchors was object, right? So that's really helped us understand a little better the many different ways that people connect with these avatars. And why is any of this important? Well, again, going up here, I think the prevailing logic for the longest time in game studies and immersive media research and VR research has always been about avatar as me. And all we've ever argued is whether or not it's you or not you. And we never seem to go any further with the research. And the argument that Dr. Banks was offering is that that's really limiting. You're missing a lot of other players out there. And although there aren't a ton of symbiote and other players, there's still lots of them. Let's consider for a moment we're talking about video game violence. Okay? And so we're talking about situations where folks do something really vile in a video game. Like super, super antisocial. Okay? And oftentimes what that means, right, is your avatar is doing something really brutal to somebody else. All right? I'm going to bring up my favorite example. And then it takes us back to the early history of video games. All right, so who's done this before? And we can let that play on loop all day, and you'll all be super violent as a result. By the way, what'd this person do to pull off the fatality? Just by their scores, what can you tell?
Pulled out the spine.
What's that?
They pulled out the spine.
No, I meant to set the game up. The trick here was they played a player 2 who didn't move.
Oh,
Double flawless victory, time bonus. Yeah, like it's an emulator, or they're super good, but the time bonus to me gives it away. So they've ripped that head right clean off that body, right? There it is. If I'm taking, so you're a psychiatrist, and you're worried that you've got a child patient, an adolescent patient who's really, really aggressive, right? If they have an avatar, well, how do I word this question? Which avatar category do you think would be the most concerning? So, kid plays this game. Okay, they play this game a lot, and they just rip spines out of people's bodies all the time. Okay? And you're worried about them. I'm going to argue that some of these categories would be more worrisome than others. What do you think?
I would say maybe the one that might be more worrisome is the me.
Probably. Walk us through that logic. Why do you think that I shouldn't be worried unless it's a me category? And now I'm actually a little worried.
Well, the reason I think, my thinking is, if you see it as me, then you might start to get like some ideas in regards to like, oh, I can do this too. Like, in regards to real life, because, that character is me, and like I can do the exact same thing.
Right. I'm literally doing it. Like, I'm practicing it. That's me on screen. Like, I'm rehearsing this. In fact, you may have heard the phrase, I think in the moral panic readings, where, some of the early psychiatrists were worried about games called the murder simulators. Mm-hmm. Right? Well, I mean, yes, objectively, that is murder. Right? Like, I tore your head out and your spine, you're dead. Like, that's murder. If you're having a me orientation, you may very well be processing this as like, I just killed somebody. Mm-hmm. What are some orientations where you maybe not be worried at all? Is there one on here where you're like, yeah, I'm not worried about that?
Well, if a player obviously looked at it as the object. This is literally just a video game.
Right. So those players are like, don't care. Like, I just beat Kano. Right? I beat Kano and I win. And here's how good I am. Right? This is actually research. This is research that I'm surprised we haven't done yet. The relationship between player-avatar relationship. And I'm talking kind of to Phil and Lindsay right now because you're thinking about research and theses. Like, this hasn't been done yet. And whether or not these different player categories might change the way we think about our on-screen actions. Because I think you're right, Alex. If it's an object orientation, that player is like, I just beat level 1. Whatever. Like, that's how you beat level 1 in a fighting game. In fact, for that player, would they make much of a distinction between the action you just saw and let me see if I can find this other one. And this one here. If you're an object player.
Maybe like the visuals, they might be like, I prefer to kill the dude.
Other than the visual aspect, because they both represent a win.
Yeah.
And in fact, the object player who is focused on challenge and competition probably is going to try to do all of them in the game. Because what does that represent if you can do all of them? Skill. Now, if the me player always prefers to grill you chicken instead of rip your spine off, maybe that's a good thing. They're like, I just beat you up and now I made you a sandwich. Right? But you can see how these player-avatar relationships might be really important because in a way, they might help us better understand how people are making sense of the content on screen. Because you could argue that you're going to see things very differently if you have a different relationship. So like earlier, we were Benjamin, we were talking about Sims torture, right? From an object perspective, it's probably not that important. They get too worried about it, right? But from other perspectives, it might be really important to worry about. So we could look at the relationship between these player-avatar relationship categories and whether or not we expect media effects. Remember in the when we were talking about media effects, one of the things that I tried to argue pretty strongly for is that it doesn't really make sense to talk about stimulus response models. And the argument behind that was that oftentimes when we're talking about media effects, we're talking about models that look more like this, where it's stimulus organism response. So there's the game, there's how you process the game, and then there's the responses as a result of that. And then it doesn't really make sense to say if violent, then violent, because you got to make sense of what's going on. And Javier, same with film, right? Like the audience has to process the movie and they're all going to process it differently, which does not mean the answer is it depends, because we know these categories are actually pretty stable. Like we find them in research over and over again, right? So this could be a really interesting application of some of these player avatar models, right? Feel free to throw, I know if your questions are popping up, feel free to toss them in here as they go. Another thing we're finding out is that we thought that the relationships would change as a function of whether or not your avatar changed. So I forget how many WoW players I have on the call, but I guess it was, maybe 2 or 3 years ago when they did their last major model update. And so what they will often do in the game, right, Blizzard, is they'll go in and they'll update character models. Because the game's been around, what, I think 2004 is when it launched? 2006? I always forget which one. But early, mid-2000s, the game's been around 15 plus years. But of course, all of the original stuff is still in the game. So humans and orcs being like the original races, right? They're still in the game. And then, of course, every couple of years, the developers will introduce new races, new classes, new characters, new avatars you can create. Well, naturally, over time, the ones that are newer are going to be a little more developed from a graphical perspective than the ones that are older. The art's going to be updated. So every couple of years, they'll go through and they'll update the old models also. In fact, I think with the new expansion coming out, they're doing it again, if I'm not mistaken. They'll probably be, I expect there'll be another model update. I don't know exactly the details of that. Certainly, I think one of the new races is like a fox race. Is anybody playing? I'm just curious. Oh, okay. I think in the newest expansion, one of the races is like a fox race. And they look super cool because they're built on 2020 graphics and technology, right? And they're super animated. They have, and of course you can see it right here with a dwarf. You can see the one on the left is the much newer one, and the one on the right is the older one. And what they're showing here is an example of even just one simple animation being updated between the two. Well, we thought that if you change the character models, that it might also change the player-avatar relationship. Why might we think that? That changing the model itself could actually change the relationship?
Because you idealize your model as you, in a sense. So if they change it out, then...
Okay, so one argument could be like, if I see that as me and then you change it, I have to reconcile with that, right? Like, oh, what do I do? Like, maybe you changed it in a way that I didn't like. And so now I don't see it as me as much. What else could go on? The changes to a character model might change other parts of the relationship. What else could go on? So one could be you change it in ways that make it look less like me or that make me uncomfortable.
Well, I would say maybe another could be how, one thing we talked about is the human likeness. And if you change it to something that's less human-like, that may be a factor.
Sure, or like vice versa. If it's more human-like, you might see it as... Could it be possible that if I make a model look more human, that I might see it more as an other? Because like now it looks like a authentic thing, right? That's a possibility. The point was we weren't sure, but there was a thought. I should say we. It actually wasn't my research. There was a thought that, well, maybe if you change these things, it could influence the relationship. Turns out it didn't. Didn't change at all. And we even looked at anybody on the call a Dungeons and Dragons player? Let me pull up this study. Let Let me see if I can find it.
I play Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, you played it before at least. Well, you know, there's lots of different ways to have a character in D&D, right? What are some of the different ways you can represent your character in the game? Or you can have a character in that game? Or rather, let me rephrase that. What are some of the different, what's the word for it? Materialities. So the different ways you could literally have a character in that game. So one is... Go ahead.
You can have like different. You can choose your race.
Sorry.
You can choose.
Sorry, I asked the wrong question. Let me start off with the easy example. So most of you who play have the sheet of paper, right? Your character exists on a piece of paper with attributes, and then Benjamin, you're talking about the different attributes, right?
Right. Yeah. Like you have your class, you have your race, you have just the stats. Like you choose like the 6 different stats and what you want to put into those.
Right. And anybody who's played this game, who's played any version of D&D, has probably seen one of these character sheets before. Right? Where you mark down, where you start off, and you carry this thing around, and you fold it up in your wallet sometimes, or you keep it stored away in a folder sometimes, right? But for how many of you is this literally your character? Like it's a piece of paper?
Only when I'm doing Adventures League.
So this is where it gets interesting. What are some other ways people can represent their actual characters in this game?
On roleplay. How they describe their character, their
So some people
story.
take their sheet, but they also fill it when they're playing in these role plays, right? Where you give it a verbal story, right? And there's still no actual thing physically, right? But there's a concept in your mind, and you share it with everybody else, right? That's how I play. I do a lot of role play. I play as a dwarf thief, and I'm a dick. And all I do, like all the time, I'm like, dungeon master, I want to rob their purse. And I'm like, roll. I roll. And they're like 20. You find I wouldn't say, well, I literally troll, but it's made to be like my character's funny. Like literally just, I troll the whole time. It's just getting in the way. It's almost like being the traitor in Among Us. Some people love playing with me because it's super, like, it's very unpredictable. And some people get really mad because they'll be like, well, anyway, I think you get the idea. So you can do that. So, okay, Lindsay, thank you. Figurines. How many of you have played with figurines before? Where you actually have physical characters for your character, right? So there's figurines, there's pieces of paper, there's the oral story you tell. What are some other things you can do in that game?
Get art commission to show certain scenes.
Yeah. Has anybody played digitally before? Some folks have played online, especially during COVID. You have a digital character. So the idea here is we did a study where we were looking to see if these player-avatar relationships would differ as a function of figurine, physical image, digital image, written down and imagined. Didn't find a difference in the player-avatar relationship. You can read that story. I should have had you read this paper now that I think about it, because it's actually really short too. But you can pull it out your own. I forget about it sometimes because I don't do a whole lot of D&D research. But we did this one. Look at the sample we got. We had almost 1,200 people fill this out. Same reason people perked up when I said D&D. Like, what? You're taking this seriously? Yes, I will of course fill out your survey. This was probably one of the most fun projects we've ever done because the people in the study were just so chill. And like they really wanted to talk to us. So we found that changing character models didn't matter. We found that having different character physical types didn't matter. That none of that changed the relationship. Why not? How come it doesn't matter what the character looks like or what you're holding in your hand? It didn't change how you felt towards your character.
Because you have a visualization of your character in your mind, and at the end of the day, really, what it is going to be you envision the events that are going down, and it's not, you don't play the game based upon the conception of what is happening on the platform, like in the physical space. You play the game based upon the concept of what you're envisioning.
Right, and I would play down the idea of it being like an actual image, but more that it's a held construct. You know in your mind what your character is, right? The bond you have isn't with the figurine, the paper, the digital thing. It's not with the character model. I think what you're saying out is it's an experience, right? Just like if your friend gets a haircut, you don't go, oh, never mind. Like, I don't know you anymore. You might joke about that, but for the most part, like, it's not that important. You know, you can sustain relationships outside of these things. So I think you're right. I think one of the things that we essentially found is that by and large, the player-avatar relationship is up here. You know, and it persists across medium. It persists across time. That's what we think is going on. And those are at least two examples where we expected there to be a difference, and there wasn't a difference. Now, one thing in all this research that has not been answered is how long it takes. It's one of those deals where it's hard to do that research without having what's called longitudinal data, where what you're looking at is, you know, the same people across a very long period of time. I have one data set that might help us with this, and it comes from some of my research in Fallout 76, and we've not analyzed the data yet. It's just sitting on a computer for various reasons. But we don't have a lot of research on the longitudinal aspects of these relationships and whether or not they actually change over time. Following me so far? Yeah, I really should have had you read the Dungeons & Dragons paper. It's actually kind of a neat one. Think of the research that we've done. It's some of the more interesting work. And Jared, I've seen bad haircuts too. I have one right now. I cannot get a haircut to save my life at the moment. Well, literally, I'm not getting a haircut because I'd rather not get a disease. So I'm letting it ride. The hardest thing to do this year has been get fresh air. Let's see here. Oh, we talked about genre earlier. So what this is here, this is a breakdown of the different par types. Object, me, symbiote, other, for action-adventure games, action games, first-person shooters, MMOs. And what these numbers are of these 73 people, how do they distribute across these categories? Of these 25 people, how do they distribute across these categories? So if you look at the numbers, it looks like there's differences. But if you look at the proportions, there's no difference. And as you see, object tends to be the most. Here, we found actually more others than we expected. But if you spread them out by condition, the proportions really didn't change statistically. So yes, 12 is bigger than 6. But if you look at the variation around the likelihood of you ending up in one category over the other, it didn't matter. Okay. And we already kind of talked about this one. This is like the different measures: investment, autonomy, disbelief, sense of control. And for the most part, we didn't see a whole lot of difference. Emotional investment was a little higher for RPGs, and that kind of makes sense, right? You're wrapped up in the story. We found, oddly enough, that seeing it as an other didn't matter in MMOs as much. And we don't have an explanation for that. But then, suspension of disbelief, pretty much same all across the board. Sense of control, pretty much the same all across the board. What we think is going on, as I said earlier, it's more about what's up here. And if it's about what's up here, well, we can all process games in a different way. Okay. All right. I want to give a moment to make sure that I'm not bulldozing over anything, or if there's questions that you had that I wasn't able to really tackle just yet from your own comments. What do you think? I mean, if there's no other takeaway, it's really, for the first part, it's this. It's that we're pretty convinced this categorization helps. How can we apply this in VR? So, like, one argument has been that the sort of trajectory of, let me ask this, the trajectory of VR probably favors which one of these categories?
Probably other.
Okay, interesting. So most people argue me. I want to walk down both these arguments. This could be interesting. Most people, when I ask that question, they say me without even blinking. Why do you say that? Why do folks say that? Like, oh, it's me. Definitely. It's about me.
Because other is the most connected you can be, essentially, from this graph. And so I'm just thinking to myself, the point of VR is to make your connection to the game as seamless as humanly possible. So I'm just thinking to myself, perhaps that's what the goal at the end of the day is. And, you know, I could be wrong, but...
Let's dial back to, like, literally the very first VR systems. What were they designed to do? When we're talking about Linear and VPL Labs and, like, the very first stuff, the gloves, headset, you know, t-shirt.
Put you in another environment, immerse you yourself, basically, like, give you a sense of you're in another place.
Yeah, the progressive embodiment stuff, right? The earliest sort of, I think, driving force behind VR was just to dump you in a space, right? And then remove the distance psychologically between you and that space. You know, the psychological sense of being there, sense of presence, right? And so one argument has been that for so long, that's been like the laser focus of VR. It's A, how do I make a world? And B, how do I stick you in it? And a perfect VR system, right, would be one in which you're there. And there's no distinction. Like, you're just there. You could step into that world and you can do whatever you want. And I don't want to talk about games just yet. I want to talk about VR as a whole, right? My guess is that and really even up to today, right, we focus heavily on sensory immersion, sense of presence, sticking people in environments. And for the longest time, it was about putting you there. And in some ways, there wasn't even an avatar, right? Because ideally, you wouldn't need an avatar, would you? Because if it's a truly immersive experience, wouldn't an avatar disrupt that?
No, if your avatar looks and sounds exactly like you.
Well, but what does immersion mean from our course? Like when we're talking about progressive embodiment, you know, we're talking about my senses being dipped into a digital space to where it's no different from me going and opening that window to walking through that door and being like on the surface of the moon, right? So at like the fundamental level, you know, in fact, the whole reason we made gloves and t-shirts and headsets was so you wouldn't need an avatar. You would just do, right? And the only reason you even need to see things is because, like, I need to see my hand to pick something up, right? And so it might even be inapplicable. It was like, well, you don't even need an avatar. Remember, our argument for what an avatar is it's your digital representation in a world. You know, Vishnu coming to Earth and having agency. But of course, in a perfect simulation, you wouldn't need a representative because you would be the representative. But of course, we know it doesn't work that way. And we also know there's lots of benefits to having avatars, or at least having representations, right? And those things work quite well for us. So I think that most folks would have argued that far and away, the me orientation was like the one that they were pushing us on. You know, immerse you, be this character, be this other thing. But now, Alex, you bring something up, and some other folks bring things up. We're seeing development of worlds, right, that exist on their own, and sometimes even have people in them that exist on their own. So how many of you have seen or used any of like the immersive media like social justice campaigns, where you like follow Somalian refugees in VR or in head-mounted display. Has anybody used these before? There's a whole... The fact that UN has a VR office. Let me see if I can find this real quick. So, the United Nations has an entire office devoted to VR. And they're it's done in concert with several film professors and other digital artists. And what they're doing in all of these things is coming up with VR films, which we could argue if that's the right language. Some people would say that VR has to be digital and fake, and these might be more thought of as like immersive videos. But if you have headsets, you can watch this on your own. They're usually all open source, open access. Anybody can watch them. But what you can imagine they do is they try to put you in the shoes of somebody suffering human rights violations. And whether that's an actual violation, or it's visiting a village, or it's you can probably imagine what some of these do. Let me see if I can. I want to see if I can play one, but play it in a way where I can show you through my flat screen how the perspectives move around. I don't remember if this one has interactive. No, it doesn't. Darn it. So this one's kind of interesting. Has anybody used Google Tilt Brush?
I used it on occasion. Back when I first got into VR.
Runs a program called Poly, or basically they're three-dimensional paintings. So what this person did is they took a graphic novel on the Syrian refugee crisis. They painted it in Google Tilt Brush, published it in Poly. This was unfortunately a flat image, but you can usually pull this image around and you can walk around the novel. So while you're reading the graphic novel, you can walk around it. And these other people have voices and lives, and you can hear their things. We've also seen one, I think I showed you in our own class, where we took footage from a flood disasters in West Virginia and showed it in 360. Put the helmet on, and then while you're listening to the newscast, you can look around and you can see things. Those experiences are interesting because on the one hand, they're putting you there. And so even there, you could argue that it's still about putting you there. Walk me through the other argument that VR could be about the other. What would be the experience or the idea behind that? So remember, other would be, I see another avatar and they are totally separate from me, but I still feel connection to them.
I mean, I think I've seen a little bit of the gameplay, and I haven't played it myself. But I mean, Half-Life Alyx, you're playing another character, and she has her own lines of dialogue and says things. Like you are embodying her, but in a way, she kind of has her own autonomy because she says her own things, and has a name that's not yours. So it's not as as other as it would be, let's say, a game where you're in the third person, but it has some elements of otherness because you're not playing as you're playing as another character, and this character has some kind of own autonomy because she has her own lines of dialogue.
So I guess one question then is, does the technology actually matter, or is it just about the presentation? So I guess one barrier would be, and maybe, folks disagree, I want to hear this, not all VR has an avatar. Would that even be an accurate thing to say?
Yeah, I mean, when you're watching the video, you're technically not an avatar when you're watching like a VR video.
Yeah.
When you play the game Gorn, you essentially don't have an avatar. You are literally hands.
Yeah, there are a lot of games where you're just hands. And
so that's interesting because I think hands would not be disqualified as avatars. They are graphical representations of a user. They have agency and they mediate gameplay. or in this case, experience.
Hmm.
This could be a really interesting conversation to have. Like, I think from the definition of avatar, doesn't require it to be like a humanoid or a character per se, right? That might be more of a colloquial use of the word. But I think from a strict definition, you know, the 10th coming of Vishnu could be a giant fist if it wanted to be. It would just be whatever avatar fits the scenario. Now, what might be true is that if it's hands, it's really hard to see them not as you. Although, couldn't it be possible to see hands as an object? Like, I'm using a VR simulation that has hands, but like that doesn't necessarily mean I see it as me. Couldn't I just go, oh, those are hands, and they pick shit up? Cool.
Yeah.
Thinking about like a table tennis game, where even though I'm the one doing all the motion and I'm super involved and those are my hands, but I might just be working at the best way to hit the ball. And maybe I don't necessarily see it as me. Remember, one of the breaks that we found in this research was that some of these things were more about the social or like, you know, dynamics. And some of them were more about, some of them were more about the ludite dynamics. It could be possible to have your hands in a VR simulator, but then not connect with them as you, if you have an object orientation. In fact, that might be why some of you said, like, hands can't really be an avatar. Maybe what the more accurate thing is, no, they are an avatar. They're just not an avatar that I am connected with beyond the physical act of hitting things. Those are digital hands, right? In fact, in many games, they intentionally don't have a race, right? Sometimes the hands will just be white. And white isn't like blanket white, like paper white. Or they'll be gray, right? Or they'll be translucent and they won't have any color. I'm thinking of the Oculus Quest. I think it's like a blue, but you can see through it, right?
Or they will literally be just a representation of your controller until you pick up something, such as the lab, which just looks like your controller.
Yeah, sure. So this is an interesting conversation. Avatar and VR might gestate differently. The somewhat irony of VR is that, you know, in reality, I can see my hands. I can see my legs. I can see my body. Right? So a wholly immersive VR system, I guess, would have to have an avatar. Because how could you have a wholly immersive system if I can't see my body? If my body's the thing being immersed, going back to progressive embodiment. Right? Which then begs this interesting question of like, would it be the case that it would always be me? When we've already shown some research in class that suggests that the materiality doesn't necessarily matter. It could be goal-oriented. It could be environment-oriented. You know, going down to some of this language, you know. And of course, the system could matter. What if I just don't think it's... But here's an irony, right? Suspension of disbelief tends to drive other. Which I think is kind of what Alex is getting at. Like, well, if I'm in like a totally immersed world and I'm in this VR simulation, I should see other. But then the goal of the programs often seems to be specifically directed at me orientations. This could be an interesting area of research because I don't know how much data we have on this. I've not seen next to any research applying PAR outside of video gaming. For the most part, it seems pretty well stuck in video games. Because, again, when we traditionally think of avatars, we're thinking of game characters. Someone asked about VR chat. Walk me through that a little bit. How could VR chat be explained through some of these mechanisms? Maybe you see all four of these.
Yeah, VR chat, like you are in the avatar of your own choosing. You know, like you can choose to be like, there's a whole list of characters like you can embody as in the VR chat. So
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting way. So like there's a whole dynamic there.
Now, you can make your avatar from scratch. Does that always mean it's going to be a me?
Hold on. I'm sorry, what were you saying?
I said you can make your avatar from scratch, of course. Does that always mean it's going to fall into one category or the other?
Well, I mean, the reason I find it where it can help that is because you can make an avatar that you can make it where it's how you want to be. Because when I say from scratch, I don't mean there's some creator. I mean, you make the model in Blender and you rig it and all that.
Yeah.
But you can either make something where it's like a representation of how you want to be seen, or you can make something where it has nothing to do with how you are and it's just a technical thing. Like there are avatars that are purely, they play videos on the avatar, and that's the only reason that person will be there, so that people can watch videos. And so it's very
connect that to what we're talking about today, because you seem like you're talking about several of these relationships.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah. So let's walk through it more though. We haven't made the connection yet, right? So I think you're right, but again, it's an example of, there's probably a presumption that it's all about me, but we know it's not true. I mean, describe your functional avatars a little bit to us. So you said there are avatars people make where all they do is like literally play videos on them.
Well, right? When you're making it, since it's made in Unity and you make it all from scratch, you can do more than just make an avatar. You could make an avatar that's a giant house that people can go walk around in, or you can just make a world as well. And
so connect that to these categories for me.
Like, if you want to make one that is purely for use, then you can, it'd be more on the object side. While you'd be able to play around and do stuff, it wouldn't be a representation of you at all. So that wouldn't be me or Symbiote or anything.
That's why I think this stuff's really important, because again, it sort of checks our presumptions about what these spaces can be. If I had to argue, or if I had to think about my conversations with developers and research over the years, I mean, one of VR's sort of critiques has been this sort of myopic focus on putting you there. Many people have argued that presence probably isn't the end goal of VR. It's a goal, but there's lots of other things we can do in those spaces too. The idea of creating avatars, why would we just want to replicate the world around us? We already live in this world. What's the point of that? Hey, I can build a digital Lubbock. That's neat. It's a neat technical demonstration. But
I think it's really cool because along with avatars, you can make worlds and see, you can make a representation of like Paris or whatever, or you could make some otherworldly planet with creatures that you've never seen before. And so I just think that's really cool.
So some of the things we can focus on here are that not all of those things we create are representations of ourselves, right? Sometimes we externally put a lot of meaning in this stuff. There are people who just make objects, and they have an avatar for a function, one function, right? And that's no different than playing Warcraft and having an auction house avatar. You have one toon, and his job is to carry shit to the auction house, and then give it back to you, and so you get money, right? In VR, you might have. I guess a lot of folks joined some of the VR chats for the Tech VR Club, and they weren't really experienced in VR. I don't know if their avatars were inherently me's. They may have just been, I got to pick something to go into the room. If I don't have an avatar, I can't have conversations. And so the avatar was literally, I need a vehicle to walk me to the chat room. No more than my car. Javier, you might be muted. I think you were saying something. I can't tell.
I was.
No worries. So it could just be the case that you just have a vehicle. Just because it's first person or a sensory immersive, which I think is the point Dylan's kind of making, doesn't necessarily make it a me, right? Does anybody have an avatar in VR that they might consider an other? There's this person who lives there, and I dial in from time to time, but it's got its own thing going on.
I do.
Walk us through it.
What?
Oh, walk us through it.
I don't know. I just feel like when I'm using my avatar and I'm walking around talking to people in worlds, I can act like a different person almost, and it's just interesting to see. Well,
and so there's also the symbiote, right? Where sometimes people talk about how it's flavors of me and flavors of other. In fact, one of the great promises of VR, right, is that it's egalitarian in nature, that you can reassemble who you are in ways that you think best represent you. And you know, that's not all that different from Second Life. So one argument I often bring up with people is that we tend to talk about how different these spaces are. But sometimes what we find out is how similar the places are. That the modality differences might just be like perspective or immersion, but the things going on aren't all that different. Has anybody here used Second Life before? I might encourage, give it a shot sometime, especially folks who do a lot of VR work, because you'd be surprised where many of the things aren't new. They're better. They're more immersive. They're, they probably encourage a heck of a lot more presence. I gave this discussion of relationships to a group of people in Second Life. It's an organization of people who are disabled. And as a result, and many of them are homebound. They cannot leave their homes. They're bedridden 24/7. And they use Second Life as a way to communicate and as a way to basically have social interactions because they can't leave their homes. Speaking of what Dylan was talking about in terms of creating these new ideas or new spaces. And when they're doing these things, their avatars, aren't also disabled. Some of them are. Some people want their avatar to represent who they are. Some of them make fantastical avatars. They can do all sorts of different things. And some of them do it for different reasons. Like one person just has an avatar that's just like a regular dude with like a t-shirt and jeans and shoes. And he just wanted to be able to talk to people. And he doesn't care at all about his avatar. His avatar is just a way for him to walk around, literally, because he can't walk around in real life and chat with people. He has no attachment to it whatsoever. And some of the people are like, they make themselves. And then one of the things Dylan was mentioning is like the real self versus the ideal self. Let me ask this. Do you think your resume for employment could fit under one of these categories?
Yeah, I would think so.
Like your
Just
LinkedIn
a representation of you, like in the character sheet.
Yeah. And my critical question is, which category does our resume fit under?
Probably me.
I think that's what everybody would say almost inherently, right? Like, well, it's me. Like, that's my resume. What could be an argument for an object orientation?
Like in regards to the resume?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if they're viewing you like basically as a person to get the job done, to do the job, like more in that, or more seeing more in that orientation rather than like a human being employee, like somebody who fits the traits the best for the job or to get the job done, possibly.
So, like, when you write your resumes, do you just write like this straight down the narrow, like normal, honest interpretation of who you are as a human being?
No, you write what they want.
You write whatever it is needs to be said to get your butt in that interview. You don't lie necessarily, but it's absolutely framed. You don't talk about like your class here today when you said smart things unless it matters, right? You contextualize that thing for a very specific task, a challenge, a competition, right? You craft it, you mark it, you send it off. And in fact, outside of interviewing for jobs, is there any other point in your life where your resume matters at all? Or does it sit on a computer? Promotion and tenure, Matt, that's true. Thankfully, I cleared that one. But yeah, it's going to matter at work when you go for promotion, right? But outside of an evaluative capacity, when does that resume mean anything?
I guess you could use it to remind yourself about yourself or something. But...
Certainly could. And I yeah, you absolutely could, right? Like, hey, like, I've done some real stuff in my career. It's an interesting perspective because, again, I think the reason I bring it up in a class about games and VR is that it might give us a thought exercise to, again, challenge the presumption that me orientations always dominate. Because if I were being very critical, I'd probably argue that more often than not, it's an object orientation. It's carefully crafted to represent a particular slice for a particular competition, and it's given away, and it's out the door. It's probably crafted in a way that seems an awful lot like you. But the only time you're living that resume is when someone asks you to live it in front of them. And otherwise, you do your work. Now, you would hope, of course, that your resume matches your daily intake and output and thoughts and experiences and things like that. But it's an interesting concept to think about how we engage avatars, So we brought up the idea that hands could actually be an avatar. They could vary. And of course, not everybody sees their resume that way. I mean, there are some folks who take it very seriously. But again, just because it's an object orientation doesn't mean it's not serious. It just means that you don't necessarily have the supremely, psychologically merged association there, right? These things can break out. I think a final point I'll bring up as we get, towards the end is I didn't talk too much about Jamie and Caleb's paper, but this kind of crazy looking mess. One thing we can think about in digital worlds is that, so we've been talking mostly about, I think, this part of the equation. Player, avatar, one relationship. Right? There's you, there's your avatar, there's this relationship. And what we can talk about within that relationship is what kind of relationship it is and what are the things that you pay attention to and care about, because they might influence how you go about breaking down these digital worlds, making sense of them, acting in them, behaving in them, being affected by them. And the point of today's conversation is that I think we neglect this relationship all the time. We assume that that person wants to be that person, and that's the end of it. And there's so much more to be thinking about in here, from design perspectives, from experience perspectives, from effects perspectives. But here's what happens when you meet somebody else in a digital world. Look at all the different relationships that immediately pop up. Because when you meet an avatar in a digital world, it's not just the case that one avatar is talking to the other one. There's two avatars. There's two people. There's this person's player-avatar relationship. There's that person's player-avatar relationship. And all of those things come together the moment you go into social VR, the moment you go into online gaming. And this part is something we're still trying to figure out, right? Because what if this person has an object orientation and this person has a me orientation? What might happen as a result? What might happen if there's a mismatch between how I see my avatar and how you see your avatar?
You might play the game differently.
Which could matter why?
Well,
you're not wrong. You're not wrong, but why would that matter? Walk us through it.
Maybe in regards to how you treat each other in game, like maybe one who sees itself as an object might see others as objects and see consequence or whatever, or feelings in regards to, let's say, killing, like let's say in Red Dead, the example you could have. While the other one may be a little more feeling towards if she gets a sense of like that character as me, or like seeing the other person's avatar as another.
I'm convinced that a lot of the root around toxic online behavior has to do with this mismatch. So we did a study on griefers, and these are video game players who log in with the only intention to screw up other people's gameplay, which is like a dick move, right? People are paying money to play games, and you're logging in, and you're just screwing with them. maybe what's going on there is that for the griefer, their version of gameplay is gaming the system. Whereas for the just standard player, their version of gameplay is playing the game. So the griefer's orientation towards their avatar, what category do you think it might fit into?
Object, I suppose.
Object. It's a mischief object. It's just it's a vehicle for them to go screw around. Exactly right, Alex. That's what our conjecture is that they're not there to like bond with the avatar so much. Now, you could have like my avatar is a mischief maker and therefore I play that perspective. So it could be another. But the one that we found was this object orientation to where they're there to mess around. That avatar is just there to help the person mess around. So this person is using their avatar in a way to screw off. And this person's using their avatar in a way to have fun. Well, this person's avatar is going to disrupt this experience because they're both engaging each other, but from very different perspectives. In some ways, is that any different than having a group project and one person sucks? It just doesn't do any work. You all are in the class for different reasons. You know, when you find out that people are in the class, like, wow, I just wanted a credit. I don't give a shit. I'm not going to talk. I don't care. I'm not interested. Just, this is the last day. We got 5 minutes and I'm out of here. Versus like, this is really cool stuff and I'm super excited about it. Those are different orientations that are going to result in different behaviors. And we see that in games. We see it in VR chat, right? We see it in lots of places. And so what's likely going on here is that we tend to make assumptions about the avatar. We tend to make assumptions about the person because of their avatar, but we don't really pay attention to this player-avatar relationship. And so this gets really, really complicated. And that's only 2 people. What happens if I were to add more? Right? I mean, what happens if I take this network and then I add like another network to it? And then you've got, you know, every time you add one person, you're adding 2 people. And every time you add 2 people, you're exploding the network. I don't know if we covered it in class, but I'm going to bring up this idea of Metcalfe's law. And Metcalfe's law explains the way networks work. And one of the things you have to understand about a network is that oftentimes when you add people to a network, you're not just adding 2 people. You're adding people and all their connections. Let me bring this up here. So this is how many connections are possible when you add more people. So 2 people have 1 connection. But again, in digital worlds, we've already exploded that because we actually say 2 people are really 4 people. All these connections start firing off. And then if all those connections aren't in sync, it can cause some really interesting disruptions, right? And so this is a model they were trying to explore in video games. What happens when people have these different interactions? And I think I won't hit you too much with all of the statistics here because they're relatively complicated. What they did find were pretty strong connections across, right? And so this is more conceptual than empirical right now. But we can think about how these things would change what's going on, right? Let's see here. What else did I have for you? Oh, and then, of course, down here, I think, again, one of the things to remind everybody of when we're talking about entertainment is that these avatars help us experience the game world and probably influence the entertainment we're going to experience in that world. That it's really hard to think about these outcomes without thinking about this relationship. And this relationship, you know, going back to the very definition of avatar, it's that representation we have in the environment, right? So there is a whole lot more we could talk about, of course. Has anybody, you know, the idea of persistent avatars? These are avatars that exist over long periods of time. And one suggestion is that we might soon be getting to the stage to where, like, you may have a relative pass away and you still have their avatar. and you still have access to their avatar. Like imagine like logging into your parents' avatar and like having an experience that they had, or like continuing its legacy. How many of you have had an avatar for more than 5 years? They can have a Dungeons and Dragons account too, by the way. Or more than 1 year. You know, I have some friends that have been playing Warcraft since 2004 or 2005, whenever it launched. Where they've had the same character for 15 years. It's a long time. I mean, for folks my age, that's almost half their life with one character. Like, that's amazing. To think about all the chat logs, all the experiences, all the collected knowledge, the people you met. We could talk about automated avatars. Avatars that do not require your input to act. Has anybody played any of the mobile games where the games play themselves? You just kind of go in occasionally and check on them, but the games actually play themselves. It's a very wild experience. Or if you've played any sports games where you do simulated games instead of actually playing the games. So you create your avatar, you play for a baseball team, but the game and the players play themselves. And you just want to see how well you would do. And it becomes management more than being involved. The one that we're probably the most excited about are going to be sort of truly intelligent avatars. And these are going to be avatars that when you interact with them, they literally are separate social agents. Like they don't, in fact, all three of these things can get to that situation. So imagine having avatars that don't require you to drive them in ways that, like, or rather, they can make their own decisions. That might distance you from them. So we might be seeing a lot more others in digital experiences here, right? And these are areas of work that we're kind of going into as we move into the future. Okay. So that's all I had planned today. All right. A quick reminder for everybody on the call. We do have a final assignment, right? Because the semester finishes out on the 9th. There's one more Moodle chat. And so the only drawback to this is that the chat this week you have to have done by Wednesday because the semester ends and grades are due Thursday morning. So I can't take anything late. What I would recommend doing is doing it as soon as you can. This is going to be a discussion of meaningfulness. So hedonism, eudaimonia, and games. The board's already live, so you can log in there right now and post things. It is worth 7 points, so it's actually pretty substantial. And for students who might be kind of on the fringe of a grade, this could bump you up. And if you participate more than usual, so if you can really get in there and go beyond the 3 posts, I mean, have conversations, make multiple posts, make a final effort to kind of engage, I'm happy to award up to 10 points, okay? Your current grades are in the grading tab, and you can see how those things are adjusted. Right now, we've attempted 93, okay? This is our last video, so we're going to send this over to Zhengda. They're going to engage with this stuff. And this coming week will be our last chance to interact with them. So make sure you finish out strong. Appreciate the semester. And unless anybody has any other questions, let's just say hey to our colleagues over there and log off. All right? Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.